Dr. Jesse D. Jenkins is an assistant professor and macro-scale energy systems engineer at Princeton University with a joint appointment in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and the Andlinger Center for Energy and Environment. Dr. Jenkins has delivered invited testimony to multiple congressional committees, and his research is frequently featured in major media outlets. He regularly provides technical analysis and policy advice for nonprofit organizations, policymakers, investors, and early-stage technology ventures working to accelerate the deployment of clean energy. Please welcome Dr. Jesse Jenkins.
Thank you all. I appreciate the opportunity to join you this morning. I hope this presentation gives a bit of broader context to the ongoing energy transition that is now underway and will be accelerated, particularly by federal legislation passed in the last Congress and by state efforts here in New Jersey and around the region, which will provide a framework for the important work that you all do to plan the vision for our future transportation system in North Jersey. So I'm going to start at the big picture, and then we'll drill down towards the transportation sector towards the end of the presentation. So let's start with the path that we're on now. Our challenge as a country is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which cause dangerous climate change, to net zero as rapidly as possible. Net zero is the point where all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions are exactly equaled out by human-caused removals of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. That's the point where we stop digging ourselves a deeper hole when it comes to the challenges and damages and impacts of a changing climate. Right? The first rule of holes is when you find yourself in one, stop digging. And that's the challenge that we face. So we have been making progress. A lot of folks, I don't think, appreciate this, that since 2005 to 2007, when our emissions peaked in the United States at about 6.6 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions, we've seen those decline by about 1 billion tons. So we're making progress. This is the pathway that we need to be on, however, to reach the goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions to half of our peak levels by 2030. That's the goal that President Biden has committed the United States to on the international stage as part of our global contribution to the effort to reduce climate change, and then on to net zero by 2050. That requires tripling the average pace of carbon reductions and greenhouse gas reductions that we've seen over the last decade, from about 2% per year to about 6% per year. So as you'll see throughout this presentation, the challenge is to go faster, 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 right? It's going to be a consistent theme. And that requires foresight, it requires public policy and investment, and it requires significant efforts to overcome coordination challenges so that we can move faster collectively. If we size up the overall challenge, this chart shows the various fuels that we use in our economy overall, or final energy carriers. This is a reference scenario if we don't do anything to accelerate our pathway to net zero emissions. And you can see that it more or less continues along as we see today, with total energy use roughly flat, although starting to increase again in the later half of the chart. That's because as the population grows and demand for energy services grow, we're also offsetting that with improvements in energy efficiency, particularly improvements in vehicle fuel efficiency, which is what leads to that initial decline before current fuel economy standards expire, and we assume that they sort of revert to the mean. So if we take a look at this, a third of our final energy carriers or fuels are carbon-free carriers, primarily electricity, but also steam and a tiny bit of hydrogen. These are fuels that, when we use them, don't emit any greenhouse gas emissions or direct pollutants in the case of electricity and steam. And that means if we can find ways to produce them without carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases, then we have a soup to nuts pathway from clean fuels to clean consumption. Now, there are a lot of different ways we can produce these fuels with clean electricity sources, right? Nuclear power, solar, wind, offshore wind, and advanced technologies coming to market now like carbon capture and hydrogen and others. So there's a lot of ways that we can tackle this third of the pie. The bigger challenge, which is where most of your work is focused now, is on this 2/3 of the pie, which is for demand for liquid and gaseous fuels, right? This is our demand for gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, natural gas. And these are challenging to decarbonize because there's not as many options available to easily produce drop-in replacements for the liquid and gaseous fuels that we consume. Right? We have a few options available. We can continue to use them in large point sources like power plants or refineries and install carbon capture equipment that can then capture that CO2 out of the flue gas and then safely store it in geologic basins. That's one option. It's quite expensive, right? We're adding significant additional pollution controls effectively onto our existing equipment, and that adds cost. The other option is to try to use carbon neutral substitutes like bio-derived fuels, right? Ethanol, advanced biofuels, biogas, or landfill gas. or to produce hydrogen or electrofuels from clean electricity or bioenergy. The challenge there is that these are all much more expensive and less efficient uses of our available clean energy inputs than producing electricity or steam. And then finally, we could continue to use some fossil fuels, particularly things like jet fuel, perhaps, that are high value and difficult to decarbonize, and then offset those remaining emissions with negative emissions technologies. Things like bioenergy with carbon capture, where the plants grow and absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, and then when we turn them into fuels or use them, we capture that CO2 and store it, and that's a net negative process where we're removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So we can do some of that. Now, the challenges we've explored in our work at Princeton in the Net Zero America study, which charted a number of different pathways to get the country to net zero, is that there are just limits on all of these options. They don't add up to collectively allow us to continue using liquid and gaseous fuels at the levels that we do today. So our big challenge then is to expand that orange pie, part of the pie, particularly the role of electricity, to displace fossil energy consumption in transportation, in heating, and industrial processes. And there are many options to do that as well, right? Electric vehicles, heat pumps, high temperature resistance heating and boilers for industry, and the production of intermediate fuels like hydrogen from electricity that can help us get the job done. Now, what that means is that the electricity sector is really the linchpin in the efforts to decarbonize the overall economy. Now, I have to admit, at some point I had to go look up what a linchpin is. It's the pin in the middle of a wagon wheel that if you pull it out, all the spokes come apart and you can take the wheel apart, right? So, you know, the key, if we were in Pennsylvania, I'd talk about the keystone, but we're here in Jersey, so I'll talk about the linchpin. So this is the thing that is not the whole thing, right? We have a bunch of other challenges we have to overcome as well, but it is the central piece of the challenge. And it's why most of my research focuses on transitions in the electricity sector. So this chart shows our current electricity supply mix. We produce about 4,000 terawatt hours or billion kilowatt hours. And about 40% of that today is carbon free. Half of that comes from nuclear power plants, a little bit more from hydroelectric. And then we have a growing contribution from wind, wind and solar power, which are rapidly expanding. That still means, though, that about 60% of our electricity today comes from fossil energy sources, about half and half from coal and natural gas. The challenge, if we are on a pathway to net zero, is that electricity demand is going to begin to grow again quite substantially. We've had basically flat electricity demand nationally since roughly 2003 to 2005, as energy efficiency measures again offset increases in demand. That is going to fundamentally change. So even as the overall energy system will see declining energy demand, the electricity sector has to get back into a growth mentality. And what that also means is that in order to consistently reduce greenhouse gas emissions as we're expanding supply, we have to deploy new clean electricity sources at an incredibly rapid pace. What this means is that by 2030 alone, we have to build the equivalent of 1.5 times all of our current carbon-free generation. And since existing nuclear and hydro plants aren't growing, that really means dramatically growing the share of our contribution from wind and solar power primarily. By 2035, we have to add as much clean electricity as all of the current electricity we generate in the country today. And by 2050, we have to add that much again. So we have to build by 2050 twice as much as all of our current generation, all from new carbon-free electricity sources. So this is the incredibly rapid challenge that we have. And again, it's because of this twin challenge. Not only do we have to eliminate the roughly 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions that come from the power sector today, but we have to do that while also more than doubling overall electricity supply by 2050 as we electrify more and more of our economy. To sum it up in a little bit shorter perspective, it's been about 140 years since the days of Edison, Tesla, and Westinghouse to build out the current energy system or power system that we have today. We now have to build that much generation twice in the next 30 years. So this really is a fundamental acceleration in our efforts to transform the way we make and use electricity. Now, what that depends on is smashing new record deployment rates, basically year after year after year. So this chart shows our historic capacity additions of new power generation of different technologies. The gray there in the 2000s is a big build out of natural gas power plants. We did a lot of that here in New Jersey and the broader PJM region after we deregulated the electricity sector and natural gas. And then you can see more recently the growing and steadily accelerating contributions from wind in blue and solar in yellow or orange. Now, this is the pace that we would want to be on if we were on the pathway to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. We basically need to double the average annual, we have to double the peak rate of wind and solar deployment that we've seen so far through 2030. So our average pace between now and the end of the decade has to be twice our peak record. And from 2031 to 2035, it has to be about 3.5 times our record. So we have to just keep accelerating. Now, the good news is that the Energy Information Administration, the federal government statistics agency for energy, just updated its short-term energy outlook for the next 2 years. And it's reporting that we are likely to see solar capacity additions double relative to their peak in 2022, which was also double the previous peak in 2020. So the solar industry is on track to hit these goals. This is not impossible. The challenge, however, is on the wind side, where the EIA expects that we will only deploy at about half of our peak rate over the next 2 years, rather than accelerating. And so overall, we need to be moving faster with renewable energy deployment as a sector. Now, this sounds transformative. It is. I don't want to undersell the nature of this challenge, the pace, the amount of infrastructure that we have to build to get on this track, but it is quite affordable. So this shows our historic expenditures on energy as a share of our GDP or our economic activity over time. And you can see that through prosperous periods of American history, we generally spend about 6 to 8% of our GDP on energy services. This is across, consumers, businesses, the whole economy. Now you can see that also spikes up to 10 to even 14% during periods of economic crisis or oil price shocks, which often precede those economic crises. And so we certainly have spent way more than this in the past, although we'd like to stay out of that range. Now, this doesn't show our current blip for the current oil crisis, which is probably going to drive things up a bit above where this chart shows. This was produced before 2021 and 2022, but this shows the pathways of our Net Zero America study, 5 different pathways to all reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 with very different compositions. And you can see that all of them involve spending less than we have historically as a share of our economy on energy services. So this is not requiring some kind of World War II style mobilization of, a fifth of our gross domestic product and all of our industrial capacity to do this. We are already going to be spending trillions of dollars on energy services, investing trillions of more in capital over the next 30 years. The challenge is to shift those investments in the right direction. Now, the good news as well is that the costs of wind, solar, and batteries, lithium-ion batteries that form the major cost component of electric vehicles, and are our fastest growing source of grid scale battery storage or energy storage, have dramatically fallen in recent years. And if you're not tracking these trends, you might be surprised to know that they are now the cheapest way we can get new megawatt hours of electricity, not just clean megawatt hours, but megawatt hours period. So if you want to add new electricity to the grid, the cheapest way to do that in most of the country is with wind and solar power. And the cost of EVs have dramatically fallen as well because we've seen the cost of lithium-ion battery packs plummet. So for solar and wind, we've basically seen a 90% reduction since 2009 in the cost of these options. And wind power has fallen by about 2/3 over that same time period. So we can drive down the cost of these technologies that when I started in this field, we used to call expensive alternative energy technologies. And they required massive public policy support to get off the ground. But that policy support is paid off by driving innovation, competition, economies of scale, and significant cost reductions, right, by a factor of 10 for solar and batteries. And we're going to do the same thing now with a suite of additional technologies like hydrogen, advanced nuclear, geothermal, carbon capture, et cetera, that we are also going to be supporting over the next decade and driving them down in cost. So we can make clean energy cheaper over time, and we're succeeding in doing so. And now, with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law, for the first time in our history, the full financial might of the federal government is aligned behind this clean energy transition. This is a marked departure from the past, where states like New Jersey or New York or others that were pushing forward in this transition had to do much of this heavy lifting on their own. We had on-again, off-again federal support in the form of certain tax credits for specific technologies, but nothing holistic and nothing long-lasting. And that has finally changed. The infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act importantly focus on making clean energy cheap, both through subsidies initially and then through driving real cost reductions over time, as I mentioned, we've already succeeded at doing for wind and solar and batteries. So the two laws together will invest well over $500 billion in tax credits, grants, rebates, and loan guarantees to make it easier and cheaper for Americans and American households and businesses all over the country to choose the cleaner option over the dirtier option in their personal and business decisions, right? It's just going to make it the better business decision to pick the clean option over the dirty option, the better household financial decision. And that includes support for really the full range of options that we would want to see deployed to transition the economy towards a cleaner, healthier energy system. That includes support for all carbon-free electricity sources that reduce the cost for states like New Jersey building out our clean energy supply by somewhere between 30 to 50% for all new carbon-free resources that we add to the grid over the next 15 plus years. In addition, the bill supports the continued operation of all existing nuclear power plants. That's really important for New Jersey, where we supply about a third of our electricity from 3 nuclear power plants in South Jersey. The state has been subsidizing those reactors, or all of us, on our electricity bills, and the new federal law will save us up to $300 million annually just for the reductions of those support for the existing nuclear plants. That's from 2024 through 2032. So that's huge savings for the state on both what we're already supporting and the things we need to build going forward. There's support for hydrogen and clean fuels. These are new tax credits that will help drive down the cost of these currently expensive alternative sources so they can become mainstream affordable options for the 2030s and the 2040s. There's also expanded support for carbon capture and storage, which can help reduce point source emissions in industry and power generation. You've probably all been talking about the support in the law for electric vehicle adoption. I think a lot of us have heard a lot about the personal vehicle tax credits, right, of up to $7,500 for the purchase of a new electric vehicle. And now for the first time, $4,000 for the purchase of a used EV. That's important because most Americans don't ever buy or lease a new vehicle, right? We buy our cars in the secondary market. And now for the first time, there's a $4,000 tax credit to support the purchase of used EVs as well. Now, what I think is underappreciated by many, maybe not those in the room here, is the business EV tax credit or zero carbon or zero energy emissions vehicle tax credit, which also offers up to $7,500 for business uses of EVs, of light duty vehicles, and up to $40,000 for medium and heavy duty vehicles, up either $40,000 or 30% of the cost of the vehicle. And that tax credit is now transferable if you are a non-taxable entity like a municipal government or a school district or others to the seller. So you can now directly take advantage of those credits for municipal fleets, for waste hauling, for school buses, and for other nonprofit and governmental uses. And so that is going to drive, I think, a significant acceleration of uptake in medium and heavy duty vehicles as well, and in government applications and nonprofits. There's also support for energy efficiency measures and electrification of buildings, particularly heat pumps to heat our buildings and cool our buildings much more efficiently. And then the infrastructure law provides about $60 billion of funding for technology demonstrations and place-based hubs, so efforts to build regional clusters around hydrogen and carbon removal. As well as important investments in network infrastructure, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with, the public chargers incentives, as well as transmission lines and CO2 pipelines and storage. So really quite comprehensive set of investments to put the country on a very different trajectory than it was in January of 2021 when the 117th Congress gavelled into session. Now, what does it mean for greenhouse gas emissions? Well, as I showed you, the blue line is where we want to be. The orange line is where we were after passage of the infrastructure law, according to modeling from a group that I lead called the Repeat Project that's been assessing the impact of these bills on an ongoing basis. We faced about 1.5 billion ton per year annual emissions gap between where we were headed and where we wanted to be to get to that 50% reduction in 2030. And the Inflation Reduction Act will close somewhere on the order of half to 2/3 of that gap. Our preliminary analysis indicates we'll be at about 42% below 2005 levels by 2030, so shy of the 50% goal, but a substantial reduction and acceleration, basically a doubling of the pace of emissions reductions that we were seeing prior to the law, but still falling short of that tripling that we want to be on. Now, it's important to note that that's just the direct effect of the law. By driving down the cost of clean energy for everyone, all Americans, it's going to make it easier for states or cities or other subnational governments or companies to increase their levels of climate ambition. So whatever level of ambition made political or economic sense before Uncle Sam picked up a big chunk of the tab, you can reassess that ambition and increase it while still, spending a similar amount as you planned before this law. And so that's likely to drive a significant acceleration of efforts at local and state levels. And it's important that it also lowers the cost of compliance with any future regulations at the state or federal level Of course, anytime a new law, a new regulation is promoted, there's a careful analysis, or should be a careful analysis, of the cost of compliance with that new rule to be weighed against the benefits of the rule. And now, with federal subsidies for basically all of the compliance options you might expect, it's easier for regulators to adopt more aggressive standards without burdening industry, households, or businesses. Now, of course, we've seen this already, this accelerating effect already at work in New Jersey. Just a couple weeks ago, Governor Murphy announced an acceleration of state efforts to transition the state towards a cleaner energy economy. That includes a commitment to accelerate our target for 100% carbon-free electricity from 2050 to 2035 to take advantage of all the new affordable options created by the law. Accelerating the pace of EV adoption, of heat pump adoption, et cetera, including the Advanced Clean Cars 2 standard, which would require 100% of sales of new vehicles to be, light-duty vehicles to be electric or fuel cell vehicles by 2035. Now, this sounds, again, like a big challenge, right, to go at this pace. What does it mean for cost? We've modeled explicitly what the Inflation Reduction Act would look like, as well as efforts to accelerate beyond what the law provides for New Jersey and the PJM region, which is the broader regional grid that we're part of here. What we found is that the Inflation Reduction Act would drive down both CO2 emissions and energy costs. So we see in the electric power sector side, emissions falling by about 36% by 2030. There's a rebound across the region if we assume that after the expiration of subsidies for existing reactors, that nothing continues in their place. I think that's unlikely, but that's, we're modeling the current law. And so if there's no further support for the nuclear fleet beyond 2032, some of those plants will retire and emissions might go back up. But if the states in the region accelerate our efforts, as New Jersey and others are trying to do, we could actually cut greenhouse gas emissions in the PJM system by 80 to 90% by 2035, while paying less in our bulk electricity supply costs than we have in recent years. So from 2019 to 2021, we paid about $50 to $60 per megawatt hour. And in these cases, we're spending about $50 per megawatt hour in 2035 for a grid that's 80 to 90% cleaner than it is today. So we can meet these goals affordably and address our climate and air pollution impacts of the power sector. Now, on the transportation side, of course, the Clean Cars 2 standard has a substantial ramp up in the pace of new EV sales. So you can see in 2021, we had about 5% of all new vehicles sold in New Jersey were electric, plug-in or hybrids or full battery electrics. That grew to about 8%, so 60% growth from 2021 to 2022. I think we're expecting similar expansion in 2023. The blue bars here are the targets set by California in the Advanced Clean Cars 2 requirements, which other states, including New Jersey, are considering adopting. So New York, Oregon, and several others have already decided to move in this path, and Governor Murphy has announced the intention to do so as well. So this is an accelerated ramp up to 100% of new vehicle sales by 2035. If we were to continue growing at 60% per year, as we have over the last couple of years, we'd actually exceed this pace. So EV adoption is already underway. The industry is investing heavily. The subsidies provided by the Inflation Reduction Act make it an economic no-brainer for millions of households. And so we're likely to be on this path even without this regulation, but this helps provide a lot of clarity for where the industry needs to go in the state. Now, that sounds like a lot of new clean electricity, a lot of demand on our grids, and that is true. We have to prepare ourselves for a growing electricity sector, right? That requires infrastructure investments of a kind we haven't seen in decades in the power sector. However, it's important to note that while we are focused on 100% of vehicle sales by 2035, sales are only a fraction of the fleet each year that turns over. And so the stock turnover is a lot slower than the sales turnover. And this chart shows that. So the blue lines here are the sales share, and the orange is the light duty stock share on the left, and the medium and heavy duty shares on the right that we project from the repeat project. And you can see that the stock turnover gives us more time to prepare. So while we have to think about pushing the new vehicle sales, we have more time to adjust to a substantial share of our vehicles on the road actually demanding electricity to charge. And the charger networks to support that. And so we do need to move, but we have some time to look ahead at the changes coming and to plan both the public and private infrastructure that we need to enable this transition. I also want to note that there's enormous flexibility in how we should be charging our electric vehicles to avoid putting significant strains on the grid. So in 2021 or 2022, the average EV sold in the United States had a 290-mile range, almost 300 miles. That's enough to meet 7 days of the average American's round trip commute. So you don't have to charge your EV every day. I bought one in December. I charge it roughly once a week, very consistent with these trends. So I not only have flexibility in when during the day I charge, but even which day of the week that we charge, right? So we have a significant amount of flexibility to shift charging patterns away from the periods of time when the grid is stressed and towards periods of time when we have ample infrastructure capacity to accommodate this charging. Now, this is only possible if properly incentivized, right? Right now, most Americans pay for a flat electricity price, doesn't matter what time you consume or where you consume, right? That doesn't vary over time. We have basically no economic incentive to carefully manage when we charge. You come home, you plug it in, that's the easiest thing for you to do, and it begins charging. And if everybody on your block comes in and charges at the same time, for a sense of scale, every 6 kilowatt home charger, level 2 charger, is like plugging in 12 window-mounted air conditioning units and flipping them on as soon as you plug in your car. So that could be a big strain, but it could also happen in the middle of the night when no one's using the grid. Now, PSEG has a modest incentive program. I'm trying to work my way through the thicket of paperwork to sign up myself. It's way too much work, and it only gives you about a 2 cent per kilowatt hour incentive to charge overnight. Now, in contrast, Xcel Energy in Colorado offers you a $20 per month unlimited charging program. Right, could you imagine a gas station offering you $20 a month for unlimited fuel ups, right? So that's the deal they're offering to consumers if they use smart charger programs that allow the utility to manage a whole neighborhood worth of EVs as to when they charge their vehicles. You put in how much range I need in the morning to get to work and back and go pick up the kids, and they manage when the different vehicles across your block charge, and that dramatically reduces the impact on the grid. And of course, it's a great deal for you too, right? $20 a month for unlimited fuel. All right, so these are the kinds of incentive programs that we need to be thinking about as a state. And if we do that, we can get way ahead of the stress on the grid. That's true for hot water heaters, for HVAC systems as well. And if we unlock the flexible EV charging abilities across the fleet and water heating, even just a modest portion of those, our team has modeled that could reduce New Jersey's peak electricity demand by nearly a fifth in 2040. These are huge savings in the amount of stress we put on the grid. Now, I want to end with a couple of important trends and benefits of this transition. The first comes from our energy security perspective, which of course has taken on even more importance in the last couple of years, both geopolitically and here in the United States. Despite the fact that we are a global net exporter of oil and natural gas now, when a dictator on the other side of the world decides to start a land war and invade his neighbor, it immediately drives up prices for all of us, for Americans all over the country, to drive to work, to do our businesses, to get freight, to market overnight, even though we're still a net exporter, right? So we are not economically secure from these kinds of global price shocks and conflicts. We may be, physically secure in a way that Europe isn't, and that's a benefit, but it's not insulated us. And it's important to know that since we discovered oil and gas here in the United States, we've basically been consuming more of it every year, year on and year out, with the exception of little 2 or 3 year long blips during recessions and oil crises. That's going to change now with passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to see now the first sustained period of declining demand for both petroleum products and natural gas in US history. Right? So our modeling estimates that demand for petroleum products like gasoline and diesel will decline by about 13% versus 2021 levels by 2030, and nearly double to a 25% reduction by 2035. So we'll be consuming a quarter less oil products by 2035, thanks to electrification of transportation. And on the natural gas side, if we can deploy wind and solar fast enough to displace natural gas in the power sector, as we electrify heating and industry as well, we could cut natural gas consumption by about 17% versus 2021 levels. So these are fundamental shifts in the direction of those industries. And importantly, they deliver enormous benefits in public health, in addition to energy security and economic security. So we modeled the impacts of reductions in particulate matter pollution from these transitions in our energy system. This has just avoided premature mortalities, so early deaths from particulate emissions. That's not the only health impact, of course, from air pollution. There's lost work days, asthma attacks, sick days, lost productivity, et cetera, and all kinds of other pollutants besides PM 2.5 that we don't look at. And just those alone could be saving, the reductions in emissions across our energy system could be saving about 6,000 lives annually by 2035. And I've highlighted the transportation sector contribution to that. It is the bulk of it. So that's all the area that has the red outline around it in purple and blue. The purple is light duty vehicle electrification, and the blue is medium and heavy duty vehicles. These are huge sources of overall pollution, and they're in our communities, right? They're cars and trucks driving around where we live, where we breathe, where our kids go to school, and they have a significant public health impact. And we're going to help clean that up at the same time, right? So we could avoid about 35,000 premature deaths over the first decade of the Inflation Reduction Act alone. That's a huge, huge savings of American lives and improvements in our quality of life. We're actually already seeing this. There's a recent study that looked at California, which is leading in EV adoption, and they're already seeing a signature in improved public health outcomes in the state, even at this early stage of the transition. So this is what's at stake. These are the benefits that we can accrue. And of course, the challenge is how fast can we scale all of our efforts up? How quickly can we move to take advantage of those opportunities? Thank you.